Okay, everybody, welcome to week number 7 of POLI223. This week I will be taking the lecture on America, populism, and Donald Trump. So, quick overview for today. Today's lecture will be looking at how we should understand populism in the US context. So, unlike some of the states we've been looking at in Europe, the US is slightly different in terms of its structures of government, and we can learn a lot from kind of the history of the American founding to kind of understand how the nation's founders set up the US system of government to kind of stop populist actors from getting into power. Leading on from that, we'll be looking at how Trump has undermined the kind of US system of government as he's being in power. Then moving to kind of populist mobilization, we'll be looking at who Trump appeals to, kind of thinking in terms of Moody's approach of kind of this idea of the people. So who are kind of Trump's version of the people, thinking of Moody's framework in mind. And lastly, we'll be looking at how Trump is actually able to successfully mobilize the people. So what kind of strategy does he use to kind of mobilize his voters kind of along populist lines? Okay, so how should we actually think about populist actors in the US? So I'll kind of start off with a bit of historical background here, just because it's helpful to kind of understand how the US is different from some of the European states we've been studying in the first few weeks of the course. So when we're thinking about the success of populist actors in the United States, really important to keep in mind that the US system was designed by the nation's founders, and the founders, such as Madison, Jefferson, were guided by a concern to kind of rein in excesses of what was known as populist sovereignty, and this was designed to prevent the rise of what's known as a demagogic actor. Populism in kind of democracies that have unconstrained popular sovereignty tends to thrive in those sorts of states. So when the nation's founders were designing the republic, they were aware of the large number of democracies that had kind of destroyed themselves over time by giving too much power to the people. In particular, some of the ancient Rome and the ancient Greek city-states in Athenian democracy. So for these reasons, the nation's founders were wary of the dangers of too much people power. And as a result, we kind of see the US Constitution is designed with a lot of impediments against the rise of populist demagogues who seek to exploit this idea of kind of majority rule or majority faction. So if we kind of think of the fact that the US president isn't elected directly by the people, so just with the nature of the electoral college, you essentially, a citizen votes for a candidate in the state, and then the electoral college casts the kind of ballot on behalf of you in Washington. So the fact that the president is indirectly elected, that's kind of supposed to be a check on popular rule. We see the word demagogue used a lot when referring to Trump, so I'll just give a brief explanation of what a demagogue is, just to kind of help us understand why a lot of people in political science literature refer to Trump as a kind of populist demagogue. So the word demagogue comes from the ancient Greek demagogos. The direct translation of that is simply a popular leader. So to be a demagogue is to simply be the leader of the demos, and again, that's the root Greek from people. However, kind of looking back to history again, the historical denotations of the word are somewhat nefarious. So demagogue referred to a rabble rouser who sometimes arose in Athenian democracy. A good example that the founders would have been aware of would have been Cleon of Athens. Cleon was famed for his harsh ruling style and kind of almost destroyed Athenian democracy because of his appeal to the common man and also kind of resentment of the moderate customs of the Athenian upper classes. Kind of seeing some allegories with Trump here already, and we'll kind of see that in the next slide when we're looking at kind of how examples of demagogic behaviour. So what are kind of some examples of demagogic behaviour just from a theoretical perspective? So these four examples of demagogic behaviour are taken from Margaret Canavan's 2005 work, The People, really good book from Cambridge University Press, CUP. So demagogues have four characteristic behaviours. Number one, they fashion themselves as a person of the people in opposition to the elites. Secondly, they have a visceral connection with the people, and it's not just a kind of normal connection of kind of likability. It's a visceral connection that exceeds kind of what we think of as kind of like ordinary political popularity. So almost kind of cult-like status among kind of the followers of demagogues. Thirdly, demagogic actors themselves manipulate this connection that they have with the people and the popularity that this connection affords them for their own gain. And fourth and finally, they break established democratic norms and institutions. So again, just kind of with my brief theoretical overview of these behaviours, kind of already seeing that a lot of this potentially sounds familiar with potentially what kind of Trump's been doing while he's been in power. Now we will look at the implications of demagogic behaviour for US democracy and also how Trump has kind of behaved like a demagogue during his tenure in office and how that's kind of affected the robustness and survivability of US democracy. So again, just looking back at history, the founders were most concerned about the types of behaviour that I've just described in the previous slide, linking to Canavan's work. These examples of demagogic behaviour also have serious implications for kind of the strength of democracy and its viability. So the two main concerns about demagogic behaviour on democracy are A, political efficacy, and B, the survivability of democratic norms. So political efficacy, broadly speaking, is just the ability of people to kind of have faith in electoral institutions and their belief that kind of their votes can matter in a democracy. So if a given kind of group or constituency of voters is especially loyal to a political actor, like Trump's voters are with him, what that political actor says and does as well concerning democracy matters. So if you have a political actor such as Trump who was kind of post-November was continuously questioning the integrity and veracity of the democratic process itself, that can lead to lower political efficacy among that group of supporters, and that also leads to kind of leads to the supporters of Trump to kind of trust the electoral process less, believe the election was rigged and that kind of thing. And that leads to kind of the outright rejection of election results, as we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Hyde, who's a professor at political science professor at the University of Berkeley, has a really good article on this as well. I've just linked it in this slide. More importantly, and kind of more worryingly, that can kind of lead from low political efficacy is the kind of trashing of democratic norms. And the trashing of democratic norms can kind of give precedent to normalise democratic backsliding, even in kind of some cases political violence as well. So if you kind of have as kind of a very large group of supporters like Trump's base who are kind of constantly being told by their leader that the election results were the election was stolen, then it's not going to be surprising to see those supporters potentially kind of resorting to violence as they did during the storming of the Capitol in January 2021. So how do the words of demagogic actors actually kind of feed into the way that voters kind of behave politically. So this chart here, it looks at the effects of voters' views in election integrity over time. So it breaks it down by partisan identity. So the red line is Trump's party, which is Republican voters, and then the blue would be Biden's party, Democratic voters, and yellow would be non-partisans, or what's known as political independents. So you can kind of see around post-election, we start to see a lot more of Trump's voters express lower degrees of confidence in beliefs that the election was conducted fairly and accurately. And this is just some kind of evidence from the polling data which shows the effects of kind of what populist actors say regarding democracy kind of on their views. So now that we have a degree of understanding of the way that Trump has undermined the US democratic system since his time in office, we'll turn to look at kind of who does Trump appeal to. So thinking back to Muda's conceptualization of the people, quote unquote, who are kind of Trump's version of the people. So if you look to the coefficient plot just to your right on this slide, this is just a coefficient plot of kind of the demographics of Trump voters in 2016. So just the reference line in the middle, and then you have the kind of blue and red bars which show two-party vote share for Trump and Clinton. So just looking at these demographics, we can kind of already see kind of a bit of a hint on kind of where Trump is doing better kind of among the electorate. So we'll start first with the gender gap. So there's quite a wide gender gap. Trump wins 52% of men compared to 41% for Clinton. Looking pretty much the inverse for Clinton. So Clinton is winning by a wider margin among women than Trump is. Age as well, so Trump is doing kind of better with kind of older people. The first two of these kind of aren't that surprising, kind of in the kind of broader context of kind of US political behaviour literature. So there's kind of generally speaking been quite a large gender gap in kind of the last 4 or 5 election cycles in US presidential elections. Democratic Party presidential candidates tend to do a lot better among women. And it's also the case that the older you get, generally the more politically conservative you are. So kind of seeing older people voting for the Trump's party kind of isn't that much surprising. When we start to see kind of the more interesting effects when it comes to kind of like vote choice for Trump, and kind of who he appeals to demographically, it comes to more like race and education. So we kind of turn into race now, see that Trump won 54% of white voters compared to 39% for Clinton. Meanwhile, Clinton's kind of running the table with black and African American voters, as well as Hispanic voters. And the most interesting effects kind of come, the most interesting kind of demographic part of Trump's base is when it comes to education, and especially kind of education among whites. So in the US political science literature, we kind of see white voters bifurcated into this idea of college educated and non-college educated whites. So in substantive terms, that's just whites with a university degree and whites without a university degree. So kind of seeing that Clinton did a lot better than Trump among whites with a college education, and the inverse of that, Trump is doing kind of a lot better than Clinton, kind of running the table almost among white voters without a college education, actually beating Clinton by well over 30 points among non-white college graduates. So that's just kind of a brief overview of kind of Trump's base of support. Probably kind of not much that's surprising here if any of you were kind of on the American politics module last year that will kind of be tying race and education into kind of like how Trump's able to kind of mobilize these voters along kind of populist lines. So now I'll just turn to unpack some of the kind of trends that we just saw in the last slide a bit more. So we'll look first at race. So if you look at the graph on your right, it shows the kind of vote share in presidential elections broken down by race from 1980 all the way to 2016. What is perhaps not that surprising is that, again, the Democrats are doing very well among Black and African American voters and Hispanic slash Latino or Latinx voters. When it comes to white voters, however, just kind of looking at the bottom line here, we actually see that there wasn't much of a kind of a statistical increase in the vote share among white voters between 2012 and 2016. So Mitt Romney was the presidential candidate in the 2012 election, and I believe he got 57% of the white vote, and Trump got 58% in 2016. So statistically speaking, Trump actually didn't kind of increase the vote share among white voters by that much. Where it starts to become interesting in relation to white voters and Trump is the type of white voter that Trump is mobilizing. So race in itself, I'd argue, probably didn't matter that much, but this idea of kind of racial identity politics and specifically white identity politics did matter. So white identity politics is basically just a way of thinking about how white voters in the US kind of see themselves politically, and we're kind of seeing race become an increasingly important factor for kind of like the way that a lot of white voters are kind of behaving electorally. So white identity politics didn't really matter kind of in the 80s or 90s, and this is because we kind of seen a confluence of changes happening in the social and political environment. So the first of these is demographic change, mainly because of immigration that took place in the 90s and early 2000s, and following on from immigration, non-white groups, again, such as kind of Hispanics, Asian Americans, are kind of have higher birth rates than this idea of non-Hispanic white Americans. So a big part of white identity politics is fear of cultural change and fear of increasing diversity. And because the US is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse at an increasingly fast pace, this is kind of feeding into kind of perceptions of what is known as kind of cultural threat and perceived threats to white dominance, which Ashley Jardina is the big scholar on here, and her book White Identity Politics is really good if any of you would like to read a bit further into it. So the last clip was just kind of an interesting way to kind of see how Trump sees his kind of voter base of support. When he says he loves the poorly educated, he says that unironically, and we once again kind of see this play out in the public opinion data and the kind of demographic data that we have on kind of white political behavior over time. So this chart here, it shows the education gap in two-party vote share, once again between 1980 and 2016. Be pretty interesting once we've kind of got some more data from 2020 actually, but I suspect these kind of gaps that we're seeing now have kind of increased further over time. So kind of looking at we'll look mainly at the right-hand side graph, which shows just white voters, while the left-hand graph shows all voters. So we kind of see an education gap begin to emerge around the 2000, between about 1980 and 1996. You can see that the lines are quite close together, indicating that the differences in two-party vote share between whites with a university degree and those without a university degree are quite narrow. Kind of post 2000 though, we start to kind of see this gap increase. So it's kind of important to note that Trump kind of didn't start the education gap among whites, but he very much kind of accelerated it. And we see this just looking at the 2016 label on the just along the x-axis on the right-hand side panel, and we can see that the gap actually widened by around 30 points in 2016 relative to 2012, which is very, very large and completely unprecedented in kind of contemporary US presidential elections. And we see Trump increasing vote share among non-college educated whites by around 14 points, and we see whites without a college education whites with a college education, going the other way. So the gap is increasing, and something that's known as polarization. So polarization along the lines of education. So just looking at this graph here, we're kind of seeing the largest effects in kind of support for Trump seem to be coming from whites who have very salient kind of racial identities, so white voters who identify as white, and also white voters without a college degree, or again, just thinking in the UK context, whites without a university degree. So kind of race and education are kind of the big factors here that is kind of driving support for Trump. Now that we have a better understanding of kind of who Trump supporters are, so lower educated white voters with kind of very salient racial and ethnic identities, we can turn to look at how Trump is actually able to successfully mobilize these voters, kind of keeping in mind with our kind of theories of populism that we've been studying. So the US is something of an outlier, kind of based on the kind of models of populism that we've been looking at so far, especially kind of Moody's approach. So the kind of hallmarks of kind of populist sentiment that we've kind of been looking at, especially for the populist radical right in kind of Central and Eastern Europe, such as kind of immigrant-based xenophobia that we've been looking at in a couple of the lectures just before Easter. Bart Bonikowski, who's a sociologist at, I think he's at University of SoCal now, he argues that it's not kind of just kind of straight populism how we've been thinking about it the past few weeks. Bart Bonikowski argues that it's something known as ethno-nationalist populism. So what is ethno-nationalist populism, and how is it kind of different from kind of variations of populism, especially kind of populist radical right populism in the post-communist countries that we've been looking at? So ethno-nationalist populism prioritizes kind of ascriptive and immutable characteristics, including race, and they apply this to kind of dominant group membership. So when I say dominant group, I basically just mean kind of this idea of kind of racial majorities. So whether it's kind of whites in the US, or if you kind of applied this framework to Hungary or Poland, it'd be the idea of kind of ethnic Poles, ethnic Hungarians, that kind of thing. So first hallmark is kind of emphasis on the importance of in-group membership and in-group identity. And it also emphasizes kind of exclusionary political behaviors, so out-group attitudes such as kind of immigrant-based xenophobia, religious intolerance, especially towards Muslims, and nativist sentiment as well. These kind of fears are expressions of what is known as collective status threat, and what kind of makes these kind of attitudes especially salient is that they can be kind of mobilized electorally by kind of populist actors such as Trump. So populist actors use these cleavages to their advantage by fueling the politics of resentment, and this resentment is specifically directed towards kind of outgroup members. So broadly speaking, in the US context, it's kind of anybody who isn't kind of Hispanic, non-Hispanic white. So kind of easy targets for Trump would be kind of immigrants and ethno-religious minorities, Muslims as well, that kind of thing. So now that we've kind of outlined what ethno-nationalist populism is, how does this model kind of fit into what we've already been kind of studying, and especially in relation to kind of Muda's approach? So the fact that these attitudes are kind of ethno-nationalist populist attitudes rather than kind of populist attitudes kind of more generally, it explains why kind of when we apply Muda's ideational framework, we tend to find that kind of supply and demand sides of populism in the US have kind of been very stable, despite the fact that kind of Trump's got elected in 2016. So Muda's framework, while it is kind of important and while it is helpful in kind of understanding the success of kind of parties and political actors, especially in Europe, it's kind of not very effective in kind of attempting to understand like Trump's victory kind of as a populist victory. And this is because it kind of misses a different dimension of Trump's support. This is related to kind of the way that Trump is kind of able to kind of activate populist attitudes through kind of what he says and what he does. So basically how he kind of behaves politically in terms of his rhetoric and that kind of thing. So the best way to explain populist mobilization along ethno-nationalist lines, it's kind of a hybrid approach between the ideational approach and populism as a political strategy. So there's kind of there's a small bit of strategy going on here, and as I've discussed in the previous slide, it has a lot to do with kind of how Trump kind of frames cultural change, and a lot of these issues I've talked about that matter a lot to kind of whites who are kind of anxious about their place in America. So a good way for kind of understanding populist mobilization along ethno-nationalist lines is to look at framing theory. In framing theory, we have this idea of what's known as resonance. Resonance is basically just the extent to which a message from a politician kind of cuts through to bases of support, party supporters, that kind of thing. So resonance in this case is a cultural process that shapes a party or a politician's ability to mobilize their supporters around the core message. In this model, framing theory tends to see kind of popular beliefs as like static and not changing, and they're kind of just waiting to be activated, kind of dependent on the right message from a populist actor. However, Barth argues that resonance is actually kind of more fluid and dynamic, and it involves kind of this idea of feedback effects, whereby solutions encoded in kind of elite frames and kind of basically what Trump is saying, it serves to kind of generate or reinforce popular fears about the impact of cultural change. Seen in this way, Trump's kind of ethno-nationalist rhetoric leads many voters to connect their fears associated with America's changing demographics with their kind of latent attitudes, whether it's kind of being worried about cultural change or their kind of fears about increasing diversity, and their support for Trump, who kind of comes along and offers very radical solutions, whether it's kind of halting America's increasing diversity through harsh immigration processes, building a wall, that kind of thing. So now that we've had a look at the theoretical approach from a populist perspective on how Trump is able to kind of mobilize his voters, we'll kind of look at these strategies in practice. So broadly speaking, explanations for Trump's victory fall into kind of one of two categories. So the first category that we'll kind of look at now is what's known as kind of the economic anxiety argument, and we kind of see this with Brexit as well, and especially around the 2019 general election. So the first one is kind of Trump's victory on the part of kind of the American white working class, who were kind of seen as being very economically anxious, and this idea of kind of economic disadvantage and that kind of thing. So, again, kind of tying in with Brexit, a lot of this is kind of linked to deindustrialization and macroeconomic trends like industrial decline. So deindustrialization is hypothesized as being very closely related to working class support for populist radical right actors in advanced Western democracies. So it's not just Trump. Again, we kind of saw a lot of it with Brexit over here, and with Le Pen as well. So if you kind of look at chloropleth maps of Le Pen's base of support, she has quite a lot of support in kind of old industrial areas, especially kind of around the Saarland. So a useful area to kind of look at is the US Rust Belt, and the Rust Belt is kind of a microcosm of kind of populist white working class political behaviour. So once the Rust Belt kind of used to be known as the industrial Midwest, and it was kind of the center of kind of America's industrial power. Start to see a lot of kind of changes happen around the 70s, like we see the closure of steel mills and kind of factories in cities like Youngstown, Ohio. These lead to significant job losses in Midwest communities whose economies were kind of once centered around heavy industry. Along with these kind of closures and declines in manufacturing, kind of come a new name for the area and becomes known as the Rust Belt. Since the 2016 election, we start to see kind of a lot of scholars, particularly kind of Macquarie and Matthew Goodwin as well, if any of you are familiar with him. They start to note that populist radical right actors such as Trump have particular appeal to kind of white working class voters in these areas. And again, it's mainly because of their kind of Trump's messaging on like the decline of American manufacturing, and that's kind of appealing to these voters who are kind of, you know, some of them might have not had a job since the 70s. They've kind of seen their communities change through deindustrialization. Also has knock-on impacts on kind of, you know, population decline, younger people moving elsewhere to find better jobs and that kind of thing. So very much this idea of like left behind areas. I won't go too much into this map, but it just kind of shows you where the Rust Belt is, just to kind of give you an idea geographically. So it's the collection of states kind of in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, some of kind of upper New York as well. And these states are interesting because these are kind of the states that actually gave Trump the victory. So Trump won by 77,000 states, 77,000 votes in Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And if Clinton had beat him by 78,000 votes in those three states, she would have been president between 2016 and 2020. So this region electorally is kind of very, very important to understand. Just kind of looking at kind of what each of the states were kind of very kind of well known for. Detroit probably most well known for the automotive industry. Ohio very well known for metals, and kind of very much the same for kind of eastern Pennsylvania. The next map links the kind of demographics of the white working class to kind of the map we've just looked at. So this map here, which I actually made for my PhD thesis, it just shows you the county level kind of distribution of working class whites. So if a county is kind of shaded in like very dark blue, that means there's a very high proportion of white working class voters living in that county. Red is indicative of kind of not many white working class voters living in that county. So kind of already seeing the areas that I've just showed you on the previous slide, there's kind of a lot of the voters that are very attracted to Trump living in those areas, and that's kind of linked to kind of Trump's overperformance in the Rust Belt and his kind of subsequent victory in 2016. So, given what I've just unpacked in the last two slides, do these arguments actually kind of hold up when we kind of look at the data? So, in other words, is kind of Trump's victory mainly motivated by kind of economic arguments, or is it potentially what I've already been talking about in terms of like white, racial and ethnic identitarian politics? So these two charts are again just from my PhD thesis. The left chart is just a voter migration diagram. Just shows you how white working class voters changed their vote between 2012 and 2016. So looking at the left-hand columns, just seeing kind of vote choice for Obama, Romney, and those who didn't vote, and then just kind of moving over, we see kind of a lot of voter migration kind of towards Trump in 2016 relative to 2012. This increased vote share for the Republican candidate between 2012 and 2016 are primarily from two different sources. So we see quite a big chunk, about 15% of 2012 Obama white working class voters moving over to Trump. And Trump is also able to kind of mobilize around 20, 25, 30% of white working class voters who didn't vote in 2012 but did in 2016. And this is kind of evidence that he was kind of able to mobilize this idea of kind of as we've been talking about in some of the seminars, this idea of kind of like the left behind voters or the forgotten men and women of kind of old industrial areas. So we're kind of seeing some evidence that Trump is able to kind of mobilize these voters, but why is he mobilizing them? Why are they kind of drawn to him? So just thinking back to my argument from the previous couple of slides, one theory is that potentially it's like manufacturing, employment decline and deindustrialization. So do we actually kind of see this play out in the data? In the analyses that kind of I've run for my PhD project, the answer is kind of no, it's potentially kind of not economic arguments. So just looking at the table on your right that's labeled table 4.2, it's just a very kind of basic regression analysis looking at kind of like how well Trump did in the Rust Belt states in 2016 relative to Mitt Romney in 2012. So if a coefficient has a positive value, that means that it's related to vote choice for Trump. If it's negatively related, that means that it's more likely to be kind of related to vote choice for Clinton. If a variable is marked with the asterisk, that means that it's a statistically significant kind of predictor of greater support for Trump. So kind of seeing that kind of a lot of the things that we were talking about in terms of demographics are significant. So the non-Hispanic white population in a Rust Belt county is a significant predictor of support for Trump. Same with kind of not having a college education. So that's kind of lending some weight into the fact that it tends to be kind of lower educated and predominantly white voters who are kind of drawn to Trump's particular brand of populism. However, when it comes to kind of declines in manufacturing employment, we do see that a positive relationship, but it's not actually a significant relationship. And that's just kind of giving some evidence that these kind of economic anxiety arguments that a lot of people have kind of put forward potentially kind of aren't that important. So if these kind of economic arguments kind of aren't that good at explaining why Trump won in 2016 and why we can kind of look at his victory as a populist victory, what factors potentially are. So one factor that I'm just going to explore over the last few slides is directly related to the model put forward by Bart Bonikowski. Bringing in a bit of my own research here, but just important to kind of contextualize that this idea of ethno-nationalism, even though it's kind of related to Trump, kind of along that cultural dimension, there are kind of a few other kind of cultural variables that do explain vote choice for Trump as well. I'll go through those briefly, but I'm just kind of looking at like constructs related to identitarian politics. I'll just be going through that in more detail than kind of the other cultural constructs. So ethno-nationalism is an articulation of kind of a specific set of beliefs about what it means to kind of be a true American, or kind of a true having a true American national identity. So ethno-nationalism is linked with an emphasis on kind of the importance of the in-group. In this case, it's kind of members of kind of the American ethnos. Ethnos is, again, just kind of a technical word for kind of members of the national, members of a group who have a shared national identity. And also emphasis on like the differences between out-group members as well. So what potentially makes one kind of truly American, quote unquote. Looking at kind of manifestations of ethno-nationalism, it's not necessarily kind of just about race. So race, and specifically like whiteness, plays a really big part in kind of ethno-nationalist attitudes. But it's mainly kind of around this idea of kind of like WASP ethnicity. So if any of you have heard of like WASPs as a group, it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So just kind of unpacking that, we have like race, Anglo-Saxon, which kind of gives hints to potential like ancestral origins and kind of nativity as well, and Protestantism, so kind of Christianity as well. Whites with very salient ethno-nationalist identities therefore consider kind of having European ancestry and descent very important markers of American identity, and they also tend to kind of share a lot of the same kind of ethnic traits that this idea of kind of Anglo-Saxons do. So whether it's kind of their ability to speak English and their Christian faith as well. How do we kind of actually see Trump like mobilize like whites with salient ethno-nationalist identities? So we see this in like a lot of his like campaign rhetoric, just kind of during the Republican primaries. So thinking about kind of ethno-nationalist whites who kind of think that potentially like being English is a very important kind of marker of American national identity. Trump criticized a lot of candidates in 2016 for like speaking Spanish during the campaign. So again, kind of a few quotes. We speak Spanish, we speak English here, not Spanish. Trump, when he kind of does this, he's doing it deliberately. So his emphasis on the importance of speaking English is kind of like giving a hark to kind of past nativist movements, like the official English language movement that was kind of around in the 80s and 90s. And his emphasis on the importance of kind of ethnic American traits, such as kind of like speaking English, that kind of thing. It's also evidence that Trump is appealing to voters who believe in the importance of potentially like living in a nation that predominantly has spoken English kind of through much of its history. Okay, so the final slide will just kind of look at how salient ethno-nationalism is for kind of like explaining vote choice for Trump, like relative to kind of other constructs that are kind of known to explain vote choice for Trump. So these graphs are from my 2020 article on ethno-nationalism. So the x-axis along the bottom, it just plots the values of each of the scales, while the y-axis, just going vertically, is the probability of a white voter having voted for Trump. So kind of looking at ethno-nationalism, we can kind of see a kind of positive linear relationship as ethno-nationalist attitudes become more salient. However, there's kind of a lot more kind of cultural constructs, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in just a couple of slides ago that explain vote choice for Trump as well. So we kind of have racial resentment, which is kind of negative attitudes towards African Americans, sexist attitudes, which were kind of especially salient because Clinton was on the ballot, and this idea of kind of demographic threats, so kind of like I was talking about with Ashley Jardina's work on threats to like white racial identity. So kind of all these cultural constructs are kind of positively related to kind of higher vote choice for Trump. So in some, economics doesn't necessarily kind of matter that much relative to kind of these constructs that I've kind of just unpacked here. Again, important to keep in mind that kind of ethno-nationalism kind of makes most sense just for what we've been talking about from like a populist theoretical perspective, but there's plenty of other kind of cultural constructs as well that do feed into vote choice.